I came here to do my PhD in 1996. I had done my undergrad and my master's at Queen's University. I didn't even know Queen's was a good university. I actually went there to play football, and it wasn't until I got there that I found out I was not a bad student, but a terrible football player. So I ended up staying and doing my master's degree. And when I first got here, I was originally doing a statistical analysis of police stop checks to see whether Indigenous people were more likely to get pulled over. And without going in too deeply into it, I didn't get along with my supervisor and met this amazing new professor who just started here, who's no longer here, Dr. Joan Martel, who became my supervisor. And so I ended up getting into work around issues relating to identity. And in 1998, my first brush with kind of talking about identity as a concept came at my candidacy, when Derek Sayer, bless him, who used to be a professor here, asked me a question after hearing me talk about Métis identity for an hour, said, you've talked about Métis identity, you've talked about kind of what it does, how it's deployed, but what is identity? Like, what do you mean when you're using the term identity? I had no answer for it, so I was just basically frozen like a deer in the headlights. And so, because I'm an anxious person, I spent the next couple of years kind of mulling over what an idiot I sounded like when I was talking in front of it. Turns out Derek thinks everyone's an idiot, so it didn't really matter, but at the time I was really kind of mortified by it. And then when I did figure out kind of what I meant by the use of the term, I was like a 3-year-old kid with a hammer. I basically, you know, when you're a 3-year-old kid with a hammer, everything's a nail. And so I used it kind of everywhere, all the time for everything. And I had never wanted to write a book because it seemed like a lot of work from the people that I had talked to who had written books. And so I had managed to successfully avoiding writing a book because in Indigenous studies, the tendency back then was more towards writing articles and book chapters rather than books. But as I saw an increasing amount of really, really terrible stuff come out on the issue that I was doing a lot of work in, which was how the Métis people were constructed in law and in the census, I thought, well, I'm being pushed into doing this. And so I wrote a book, and writing a book is a terrible experience. I mean, I know it makes you a better person and you learn more and stuff like that, but it's a lot of work, and it's both kind of super gratifying and really exhausting at the same time. And so when I was reading the book, I came across an article by Rogers Brubaker and Frederick Cooper called Beyond Identity. And I think this was from, the article's from, it's a fairly old article, 2003, 2004, something like that. And they sort of make the claim in this article that people use identity too indiscriminately. So it comes to mean kind of everything and nothing, and because of that, it's not really very useful. And certainly in an Indigenous studies context, there's a lot of laziness around the use of the term identity. When I was writing my book, I finished the first draft of the book, which is about, 300 double-spaced pages, and I counted the number of times I'd used the word identity in the book. And I stopped counting at 380 because I got really, I started getting embarrassed because it was so often. And so then I tried a thought experiment with myself, and I took all of my uses of identity out of the book. So when I use the term identity in a particular context, what more precisely did I mean when I used the term identity? So I yanked everything out, and I ended up, there's probably about a dozen uses of the term identity in the book now, because part of the problem with identity, part of the problem with the way that we talk about identity is that it's so ubiquitous that if you actually want to have a conversation with somebody else, it becomes like this transit point. So people have to know that you're talking about identity, and as it turns out, not that many people know that you're talking about identity unless you actually use the term identity. And so I find myself in this kind of weird situation where I keep saying, I'm not going to use it, I'm not going to use it. I did 10 interviews last week with various media outlets for the new Aboriginal population numbers that have come out, and I tried in the very first interview to say, well, I don't really think it's useful to think about. Nobody had any interest in thinking about this in any other terms than identity. And so the next 9 interviews, I was just like this drone going through to have this discussion on identity, even though part of my work is on how we shouldn't really be using that term. I think it's really important that we need to think about identity. When we think about identity, we have to differentiate, as Brubaker and Cooper did, and as various other people have done, between identity as a category of analysis, which is kind of our stock and trade, and identity as a category of practice, which is most people who aren't in academic context would think and use the term. And I think it's fine when people who aren't in an academic context talk about identity, but I think it becomes more problematic for people in the academy to use the term identity. And currently I'm engaging in the idea of identity because I'm exploring how white people are making claims to being Indigenous based on self-identifying claims. latest census numbers that the Métis population is up 42% in the last 10 years. The overall Indigenous population is up about 39%. And I work with some StatsCan folks, and they're fantastic. But they're very stuck because what censuses do is censuses require self-identification as the basis to making claims for things. And that's a huge problem when you're using self-identification as the only or the most important dynamic for how we think and talk about what we mean by identity. And I know one of you smartasses is going to ask me what I actually mean by identity, so I just tend to think about it in the context of self-making through social interaction, so kind of drawing off of what Henry Gates Jr. talks about. When I was looking at the stuff, I was interested in kind of looking at these folks who self-identify as Indigenous and either have very distant Indigenous ancestry or based on kind of myths and misconceptions about who their ancestors might be, or just kind of straight up fabrication. So they just kind of invent somebody as they go forward. And Cersei Sturm wrote a book called Becoming Indian, where she does this really sophisticated job of talking about white people, why white people make claims to indigeneity when they don't have anyone to claim them back. So I would certainly point you to her book in particular to talk about these issues. And so I've written about what I call inert kinship, in which when these people do make, when these people do move beyond self-identifying as Indigenous to look for something to attach that claim to, it's never living, breathing Indigenous people that are existing here today. It's always these kind of inert forms of kinship that don't talk back to them. So DNA, archival, court documents, those kinds of things. So there's kind of this white possessiveness that kind of underlies this, these claims that they're making. I don't know if any of you have read Aileen Morton Robinson's stuff. She has her recent book is called The White Possessive, and she talks all about kind of the manner in which indigeneity gets gobbled up in kind of these movements. And I've talked about this before as kind of, especially in a reconciliation atmosphere like we're in now, you get people, it's almost like this, it's almost like, I'm older than a lot of you in here, but when I was a kid in the 70s, we used to have this game called Hungry Hungry Hippos. Do you guys remember that? Where the balls drop in the middle and then everyone bangs the things and these hippopotamuses jump out of the sides to pull the things back. Well, that's what it's like when people are kind of making these claims to indigeneity when they don't have to worry about being claimed back. When you call them on it, you get called racist, you get accused of lateral violence, you get accused of internalized colonialism, et cetera, all these kinds of things. The concept of identity as a category of practice is incredibly generative, right? I mean, I think this idea of belonging and the way in which we think about the relationship between identity and belonging for people who aren't academics. I think it's a useful way for them to kind of reach out to Indigenous communities that they may have kind of attenuated connections to, but it's a way for them to kind of connect again and talk about kind of how coming into that identity can be kind of productive for them and productive for their families, extended families, and communities. As a category of analysis, the concept of identity, certainly in the context, this more specific context about talking about Indigenous issues, is super problematic. I think it's a super problematic the way that identity gets used when we talk about Indigenous issues, and there are a lot of different terms that we can use to be more precise about what we're talking about. And of course, the main problem, as I was saying earlier, is that when we use identity to talk about sets of social relations that are not just conflicting, not just kind of at odds with each other, but sometimes entirely opposed to one another, then what are we actually thinking about analytically, and what are the kinds of things that we're missing when they do that? So I think it's not a particularly useful term to think in Indigenous studies context, and I also feel the same way about race as a category of analysis as well. It's not a particularly useful term for thinking more precisely about the kinds of issues that we should be thinking about.